Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Two of the world's maritime choke points are the Suez Canal and the Straits of Hormuz. Shipping between north and south, west and east goes through them and can be interfered with. But between them, there is the Red Sea, with Bab el Mandeb as the gate whose potential closure threatens Israeli trade with Asia. Egypt used its proximity to this strategic choke point in its conflict with Israel, and now the Houthis of Yemen, an Iranian proxy hostile to Israel, have been escalating their efforts to goad Israel into an additional front, first by launching missiles and drones, and then by taking over British-registered Bahamas-flagged vehicle carrier. This belligerent action, challenging all shipping in this sensitive area, invites reaction by Israel, the United States, and essentially all nations concerned with maritime security. To explore this issue, let's turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Thank you for joining us, General.
Thank you for having me.
It's good having you indeed. And with me here in the studio is our TV7 Editor-at-Large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, please set the stage for us.
So as we in Israel all remember, or at least the older generation does, the wars of 1956 and 1967 had a lot to do with the Egyptians blocking the Straits of Tiran. Now, in 1973, the Egyptians have bypassed the Israeli ability to go through the Straits of Tiran and have closed the Bab el Mandeb Straits further down. Actually, Israel intended to send missile boats around the Cape of Good Hope and bring them to Eilat, to the southernmost port, but the war preceded that. Now, many Israelis are perplexed. What do the Yemenites want from us? We have no conflict with them. All of a sudden, when we are involved in a war in Gaza and we have another sort of war of attrition with Hezbollah, the Houthis, of all people, rise and lob missiles and drones at us. So obviously, this is part of the larger Iranian scheme, the legacy of the late but not great Qassam Soleimani. And up to now, Israel has kept its patience and discipline and did not respond to the Houthi provocation, obviously being helped by two U.S. Navy destroyers, originally part of the Ford carrier task force, but having passed through the Suez Canal, they have managed to intercept drones and missiles coming out of Yemen, out of what the Houthis tried to inflict on Israel. The latest example of the Houthi approach, the attempt by them to interfere with shipping by boarding this car carrier registered in the Isle of Man, in the British Isles, flying a Bahamas flag, being partly owned by an Israeli. What does that have to do with the state of Israel? Obviously, it's a pretext. Now, if this goes on, the Houthis will not remain unpunished.
Of course, it's partly owned by an Israeli national who doesn't even live in Israel, and we can go on and on about those various issues, but ultimately what it comes down to, and I think, General Kimmitt, when I looked at the video that Ansar Allah, namely the Houthi tribe-dominated terror organization, or essentially not a terror organization since it was revocated by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in his first month in office from the foreign terrorist organizations list of the State Department. Nonetheless, the thing that struck me in that video was a young member of this Ansar Allah terror organization walking inside that vessel, declaring death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory to Islam, and then proclaiming that they stand behind the people of Gaza and their war against Israel. Of course, this is a literal translation from what was said there in Arabic. But what do you see when this organization is starting to, quite frankly, abrupt international shipping, which may have quite the consequences for not only maritime shipping to Israel, but globally?
Well, to me, first of all, I was very surprised that the Houthis now wear GoPros on their helmets, and they look pretty confident and pretty well trained as they took that ship. What it tells me is that this is just another pattern of this swarm operation that Iran is running, where talk about drone swarms or missile swarms. In this case, you're actually seeing, in my mind, the Iranians conducting swarm attacks around the region, whether it's what's happening in Gaza, the provocations inside of Iraq, the missiles coming from the Houthis, now other operations with the Houthis going in, taking international shipping. It just seems as if the Iranians are trying to overwhelm the system with a series of small pinprick attacks so that something is overloaded, whether it's the U.S. policy or whether it's the Israeli capability.
Let me follow up on this point, and that is the U.S. Central Command, under its NAVCENT component, has Task Force 153, in which the U.S. Navy, in collaboration with the Egyptian Navy, aim to guarantee the maritime shipping through Bab el Mandeb and the adjacent waterways. My question to you is, what went wrong in the scenario that ultimately brought about the seizing of this commercial vessel?
Well, Jonathan, I think it was, again, as we've seen in the last couple of months, another intelligence failure. Now, was this failure a result of sloppiness on the part of the leadership and the Maritime Task Force? Or was it simply that they were looking for a maritime threat rather than an airborne threat? I think that will probably be determined in the weeks ahead. It is interesting that very few people are talking about this because I think they're actually trying to figure out what happened as well. Nonetheless, I'm sure that Task Force 153's focus right now is not looking backwards, but looking forward.
Yes, sir. Mr. Owen?
We all remember that the attention to Yemen, Aden, started with the USS Cole 23 years ago. And at that time, it was probably considered Al Qaeda and may have been a precursor to 9/11. What happened there in this part of the world, which used to be very poor, poverty-stricken? All of a sudden, the Iranians have poured in a lot of resources, probably in order to get Saudi Arabia from the south. All of a sudden, it emerged as a threat to be reckoned with. Also, there were Iranian shipments or transshipments to Gaza or to the Palestinians in general through Yemen. Of the South Yemen region, which was not really part of the Arab-Israeli conflict, suddenly or gradually became one.
Well, listen, the United States was in fact an ally of the Houthis in the early 2000s. Obviously, we took our eye off the ball. The Houthis changed their nationalist goals. The attempt by some actors to try to split the country again into the old South Yemen and PDRY didn't bear fruit. So I just think it's generally a lack of attention and a focus elsewhere by the regional players is what allowed the Iranians to come in and basically infiltrate and inculcate themselves into the process and into the Houthi background. Again, as you take a look at those Houthis that did take this ship, that did not look like a tribal force coming out of North Yemen.
It was quite similar to the methodologies utilized by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards just recently when they captured a Greek vessel carrying oil through the Strait of Hormuz, not far from the uh, international, national waters of Oman. But Mr. Owen, I'd like to ask you, if I may, when we're looking at the map, there's so many countries that are involved in the waterways, extending beyond, of course, the Red Sea, also into the Bab el Mandeb and the other
Indian
areas
Ocean.
there, indeed. How do you see this part of the waterway, which is so strategic, with so much volume passing through on a daily basis, becoming a focal point of terror, particularly directed by the Islamic Republic of Iran?
It's quite bewildering because Iran is vulnerable, especially in the maritime domain. It has such a long coastline. The port of Bandar Abbas is particularly vulnerable both to kinetic as well as cyber attacks. It can be shut down, and they know that they shouldn't try to interfere with shipping to Israel, from Israel. Most of
Based on past experience.
of course, all of this gray zone fighting which has gone on between Israel and Iran is quite understood in Tehran. They have not tried to act against visibly Israeli targets, but only those with a very tenuous connection. As you said, a former or part-time Israeli national with part ownership of a British ship flying the flag of Bahamas. Perhaps we should go back, Mark, to the reflagging practice of the 1980s
Yep.
that took place in the Persian Gulf when they tried to interfere with Kuwaiti shipping and other stuff while they were fighting Iraq, of all countries.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good policy, but at this point that may be a little too extreme. There are intermediate steps that can be taken, whether it's the use of shipwriters, private security contracts, or the escort missions. It is only at a last step when you really go through the process of reflagging, because again, if you reflag to put an American flag on there, you essentially are saying that an attack on that ship is an attack on United States commercial interests. So I think it is not, we're not at that stage yet, but obviously if this continues on to the level of hijackings and that we had off the coast of Somalia for years and years, you may have to resort to that level of protection for the ships, because as you say, this is part of international commerce, and if one blocks the global commons to international commerce, the commercial consequences alone are dramatic.
What in your view, is the Chinese role here? Because they took turns heading this particular task force, but they are also suspected of using that in order to enlarge their naval activities and presence in the area. Is their role benign or malign?
I actually think it's benign. It is interesting that in 2009 to 2011, when China joined the Combined Maritime Task Force to prevent piracy off the coast of Somalia, they were an active participant. But it's interesting to note that this was the first blue water operation that the Chinese military had conducted in anyone's memory. And they followed that up not only with operations inside of the Combined Task Force, but they also got themselves into Djibouti, and they've now built the largest naval base outside of China in Djibouti. Now, it would surprise me if the Chinese somehow were trying to inject themselves in a malign way, because they are extraordinarily vulnerable on a commercial basis as well with their own shipping, and with the problems that the Chinese economy is having right now. If there was any kind of shipping embargo uh, against China, that would cost them billions, if not trillions. So I can't see a logic for the Chinese doing this in a malign way.
You know, on a visit of
Just
East Africa a few years ago, it turned out that the Chinese have systematically bought almost the entire fishing industry of several countries there as part of their commercial ventures. But obviously, the Navy follows the merchant marine and trawlers and these sort of vessels.
Well, I'd like to revert to the topic at hand, and that is ultimately when we're talking about the complexities and the challenges emerging out of the Red Sea, of the various waterways. There was such a scenario in which the Strait of Hormuz was already under attack, an attempt by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard to block the various waterways, and the American reaction at the time, showing leadership, ended that issue. Set the stage for us, Mr. Owen.
Well, you know, you mentioned Oman earlier. There is this dispute over the three islands between Oman and Iran. It is not that easy to block the Hormuz. I think it's somewhat similar to Gibraltar. You have to put ships in there. You can't do it from your coast. But General Kimmett, correct me if my geography is too simplistic.
Well, I think the Iranians have a ground-to-ship capability in their missile technology right now that would, in fact, put an unarmed ship without the proper defensive measures at risk. So ship to shore or shore to ship, I think that the Iranians could do this from land. I think it's more important to notice, Emil, that the Iranian Navy has a tremendous underwater capability for this kind of operation. So if they were serious about preventing ships from going through that area, and they had not only a willingness, they certainly do have a capability to stop the shipping with their miniature submarines, with their significant underwater missile technology.
And mining too? Or is that too risky because there are other ships there, innocent shipping that they wouldn't want to interfere with?
Well, look, if anything breaks out of this magnitude, either they're using harpoon-like missiles or they're underwater missiles. Every ship is at risk. There are no non-combatants in the Persian Gulf at that point.
Mr. Owen, what is the Israeli response? Considering the fact, obviously, Israel is not a large naval power, but it does have at least half of an entire submarine fleet. It has various strategic capabilities at that, and just recently also gained some additional frigates from German manufacturers, which have been integrated already into the Israeli Navy. Is it truly capable of taking part, for instance, in Task Force 153 that is in charge of the waterways that have been targeted?
That's a political decision for the other participants. And we saw that even when the Fifth Fleet has undertaken several exercises, which included Saudi and Israeli officers, it wasn't really multilateral. It was the Israeli officers with the American ones and the Saudi officers with the American ones, but not all of them together. But the greatest asset of the Israeli Navy is the Israeli Air Force, which has range and can get there. Of course, there are combinations and there are other forms less visible, and we have naval commandos and other forms of warfare if Israel chooses to do it. But regarding Yemen, with the two ports of Aden and Hodeidah, they are also vulnerable. So the Houthis can start a conflict, but they may be on the receiving end too.
Indeed. Well, General Kimmett, for such a reality to take place, obviously the United States would have to remove its objections. And taking into account also what we discussed yesterday, uh, do you see the Biden administration allowing Israel, and sorry for saying it so blatantly, but allowing Israel to expand its area of hostilities versus the various terrorist organizations, also to Yemen, particularly vis-a-vis the Iranian proxy Ansar Allah?
Knowing the way that this administration thinks, I think that they would probably ask Israel to relieve some of the responsibilities inside the Mediterranean so that they could take those assets from the Sixth Fleet and get them through the Suez and down to help out in Yemen. You're right, it would be a political decision, but I think the way this administration considers the relationship with Israel, it's primarily one of our support for the defense of Israel, not our use of Israeli assets in a reciprocal type of operation.
There is also another factor, and this is the Saudi one. Back in the 1960s, when the rebellion, the revolt in Yemen started, when it was still a monarchy, Saudi Arabia asked the United States and Britain, and they came to Israel to help the royalists by dropping from cargo planes supplies and other stuff. And it was a clandestine Israeli participation in this action in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, what you mentioned earlier regarding the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration vis-a-vis the Houthis and the terror organization list had to do with Saudi Arabia against the Houthis. This was part of a mediation effort to get a ceasefire there and hopefully to end the conflict. So before Israel goes to war against Yemen, essentially, it will consult Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis helped intercept one of the launches because they didn't know whether it was going to land in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, or in the Israeli city of Eilat. So the American, Israeli, Saudi...
Well, it was batteries in Saudi Arabia happened to be a European actor that intercepted that missile.
Yes, but Saudi Arabia allowed it. It had a sovereign right to decide not to do it.
Indeed.
So it would be interesting to see how MBS would react to such an initiative by Israel.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of this program, and this is a theater that I must say is ridden with complexities, with, according to the statistics, and obviously those statistics are very problematic, but every 10 minutes, roughly, a Yemenite child dies from starvation in that country. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's literally that way, but it means that many children are dying there from malnutrition and a lot of challenges that ultimately brought about the United Nations to pressure the United States under the Biden administration to revocate the designation of Ansar Allah, which has managed to embroil any humanitarian aid entering into Yemen per Iranian architecture of the Islamic Republic as well. Everything goes through this terrorist organization, and therefore the Biden administration decided that it would be better to revocate and not call them terrorists in order to be able to continue to supply them with various goods. Nevertheless, General Kimmett, when you look at this theater, and as Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, you dealt with many of the issues pertaining to this theater. What needs to be done at this stage to, at the one hand, contain, but at the other hand, also deal with the issues at hand?
Look, I probably was more involved in this region as a CENTCOM planner, and we dealt with these kind of contingencies every day in the planning shop. The short answer is, things were bad back then, but at least we understood that there was an overarching theater strategic plan that involved defending our friends, deterring our enemies, keeping the international commons open, preventing the spread of nuclear material, and then fight the current wars. And unfortunately, we seem to have a problem with all of those areas now. I'm glad I'm not at CENTCOM, and even more glad that I'm not at the National Security Council, because one has to really wonder if, as you take each of those challenges, defending our friends, deterring our enemies, and so on, whether a scorecard of this administration would demonstrate that they're successful in any. But even more concerning is that those elements were meant to be part of a cohesive strategic plan for the Middle East, which is one of deterrence and assurance that comes straight from the White House. I don't think that our friends in the region see us as reliable, and I don't think that our enemies there, primarily the Islamic Republic, see us as credible. So if you aren't credible to your enemies and you're not reliable to your friends, nothing can follow from that. If I was advising President Biden, I think the advice that I would give him would simply be, you'll never succeed in your Middle East policy until your friends think you're credible and your enemies think you're credible and your friends see as reliable, because right now neither is happening.
Thank you indeed. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, but I'd like to thank General Mark Kimmett, as well as Mr. Rogan, for taking out of your time to be part of today's panel as well. And I'd like to thank all of you at home until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.